Our speaker tonight is probably well known to most in the room, but just to give you some background about Luke, he grew up in Sandpoint and holds a PhD in political science from Yale. He's also taught civics and political philosophy at Columbia American University and Boise State University Honors College. He's also written about the ideas of America's founding fathers, including a book on President John Adams. In 2017, he co-founded Reclaim Idaho, which is how I think most of us became part of this fan club, and that's a grassroots organization that spearheaded Idaho's Ballot-Initiative to expand Medicare coverage to 90,000 Idahoans. And in 2021, Reclaim Idaho won a landmark case in the Idaho Supreme Court that enshrined the Ballot-Initiative process as a fundamental right in the state of Idaho. And in 2022, the organization led a campaign that successfully pressured Idaho lawmakers to make historic investments in Idaho's K-12 education. And since then, the organization has worked to promote affordable health care, strong public schools, common sense electoral reform, and ballot initiative rights. And that's what Luke is going to talk to us tonight about.
Thank you for that intro. League of Women Voters of Moscow, and for all of you for being here tonight. I want to start with a question. I actually want you to raise your hand and try to answer it. To get there, I'm going to tell you a story of something that happened last week. I was at College of Idaho down in Caldwell and speaking to a classroom full of students, about 30 students at the College of Idaho. And I asked them to imagine a candidate running for governor in the state of Idaho. And I told them, I'm going to describe this candidate to you. And I told them, I'm going to ask you in a moment whether you think this candidate would win. So I went on to describe this imaginary candidate as an energetic candidate running for governor on an ambitious agenda. They wanted to do things like expand funding for public education, expand healthcare coverage to low-income people all across Idaho. They wanted to protect the environment. They wanted to clean up the campaign finance system. And not only that, they didn't just want to go around talking about slogans. They actually had a whole slate of laws they wanted to pass. So on healthcare, they wanted to expand healthcare coverage to nearly 100,000 people all over the state. They even wanted to make healthcare more generous for seniors in the state of Idaho and fill in some of the gaps there. When it comes to the environment, they wanted to regulate some of the most damaging mining practices when it comes to rivers and streams. They wanted to take wildlife management out of the hands of politicians by creating more of a professionalized civil service system of wildlife management. They wanted to expand funding for public education by hundreds of millions of dollars, not just by in a fragmentary way. They wanted to strengthen collective bargaining rights for teachers so that teachers could be in a stronger position to bargain for better salaries, and benefits, and workplace conditions. They wanted to, when it comes to campaign finance, they wanted to create a system of transparency so that anyone donating to a campaign or donating to a lobbying effort had to actually make themselves public so that people would know where all the money is coming from. So this bold, ambitious agenda across all these issues of healthcare, education, environment, campaign finance. And then I asked the students in that classroom, can you give me a show of hands how many people think that candidate could win? And out of 30 students, not a single hand was raised. And then I asked them, okay, I'm just making sure you're paying attention. Show of hands to them. How many think that candidate would lose? Every single hand raised that candidate would lose. And then I said, if you raise your hand, you think that candidate would lose, tell me why. And then there were 3 different immediate hands that went up, and I called all 3 of them in order. One of them said that this is Idaho, maybe even all across the country, but especially in Idaho, people don't like taxes. And most of those reforms you described would require taxes. Someone's got to pay for those things. That's not going to fly in Idaho. And then I called on the second hand. They said, all those things sound like things Democrats do. And this is Idaho. This is a red state. We know that. It's not someone who's going to get elected. And then I called on the third hand, and this was actually one of the professors in the room. And he said, a whole bunch of those things you mentioned, for example, regulating, mining practices to clean up rivers and streams, or creating a more transparent campaign finance system, those are going to be viciously opposed by special interest groups and really powerful special interests, so that's not going to fly in Idaho. At that point, I backed up and I revealed to them a surprising fact that I think surprised everyone in the room. And this is my question to you all here tonight. What do you think that surprising fact was? Can anyone guess? Can you just raise your hand and guess? Yeah, go ahead.
That was Cecil Andrus, maybe, or that was.
That it could have been Cecil Andrus that did all those things, a past governor, maybe a governor who was more progressive from earlier time in Idaho history. Okay, so that's a guess.
Or Teddy Roosevelt.
Could have been Teddy Roosevelt, maybe as governor of New York or something. Okay, good guess. We'll talk about Teddy. I actually am going to talk about Teddy Roosevelt in a minute, so it's a good plug for that. Any other guess? What was the big surprising fact?
Brad Little.
Brad Little, what about Brad Little?
He was the one who said those. He probably promised it all.
Did he promise those things, all those reforms, but maybe didn't do them, right? But promise them. Okay, so some guesses of what that big surprising fact. Here's what it was. Every single reform that I named is already law in Idaho, but not because the governor ran for office, not because Brad Little or Cecil Andrus or anyone else, and not because of the legislature. Every single one of those reforms I named was passed into law through the citizen initiative process. So let's run through it really quick. 2018, expansion of healthcare coverage to almost 100,000 low-income Idahoans. 1948, something called the Senior Citizen Grants Act, which was later overturned, but it created something like a basic income, expanded Social Security in Idaho, and also promised increased medical coverage for seniors. And it was overturned for complicated reasons. Go down the list. Education in 2022, and some of you here were a big part of this, we got on the ballot something called the Quality Education Act to increase funding for public education by over $300 million a year. And even though it didn't go all the way to the voters, it did pressure the governor and the legislature to increase funding for public education by hundreds of millions of dollars. And that included, by the way, funding that created the Idaho Launch Program that's now providing scholarships for grants for thousands of kids who maybe wouldn't have otherwise been able to go to college or trade school. In 2012, the people of Idaho, and some of you in this room I know a part of this, the people of Idaho rose up and passed a citizen referendum as part of what was called the Luna Laws. And that referendum restored the bargaining rights of teachers so that teachers were in a stronger position to bargain for better salaries, benefits, workplace conditions. In the 1950s, a bipartisan group of citizens came together and passed an initiative to regulate dredge mining and put some limits on certain types of dredge mining that were causing a lot of problems for Idaho's rivers and streams. In 1938, the people of Idaho, through initiative, created a non-partisan, professionalized civil service to manage wildlife in Idaho. That's called the Department of Fish and Game. That was done through initiative. And then in 1974, the people of Idaho came together and passed an initiative called the Sunshine Law. That's why, to this day, you can go on the Secretary of State's website, and find who's donating to campaigns. It's not a perfect system. There's still some ways people figure out to get around it, but it exists. It is a very good system to the extent that it works, and it was passed by citizen initiative, the Sunshine Law. Here's another question for you all. And this was foreshadowed earlier, why is this building called the 1912 Center that we're sitting in? It was built in 1912. Is it also, my understanding is it might also be a little bit of a tribute to something going on in 1912. So one guesses the initiative system is established. So I'm going to go, after this event, I'm going to go, if I would have got here earlier, this was my plan, but I'm going to go read some of the plaques around the building, because what I recall is that it's also something of a celebration of the incredible outpouring of civic organizing that was happening at that time. 1912, maybe more than any year in American history, was the year of what was called the progressive movement, the kind of climax of the progressive movement. And a big part of that sweeping reform movement that swept all across the country, especially in the western United States, in places like Idaho, a big part of it was the establishment of the citizen initiative. So here in Idaho in 1912, a coalition of reformers in the Idaho legislature decided to put on the ballot for November of 1912 a constitutional amendment to create the citizen initiative process. And there was a big debate in Idaho and around the country about this thing called the citizen initiative process, where citizens don't have to wait for the legislature or a governor to pass a reform. They can actually get signatures, put a reform idea directly on the ballot, and then if the majority of the voters vote for it, it actually becomes law. Citizens make their own laws. There was a big debate about this. And some who opposed it said, look, that's not our system of government. This whole citizen initiative idea, that's something like direct democracy, like maybe what they had in ancient Athens. But it's not what we have in America. In America, they said we have something called representative government, or a representative republic. People don't make their own laws in America. They elect representatives. to make the laws. We have a system of representation. But then on the other side, the people who believed in the citizen initiative process, they didn't say, we want to overthrow the whole system and create a system more like they had in ancient Athens, a direct democracy system. What they said is, we can actually make our system of representative government better by also giving the people a more direct voice some of the time through an initiative process. And that's where Teddy Roosevelt came in, because he was actually running for president that year on a third-party ticket. And there are a bunch, I've gone back and looked at the numbers. There are a bunch of counties in Idaho where he won the majority of the vote as a third-party candidate that year. He was on the Bull Moose Party, the Bull Moose Party. And he went around and was running for president, but he was also advocating for the initiative process along the way. And at one point in Ohio, he gave this speech where he said, the initiative process is not meant to destroy or replace the system of representation. The initiative process is meant to correct the system of representation when it becomes misrepresentative. It's meant to correct representation when it becomes misrepresentative. In other words, when the representatives we elect become out of touch on some issue, they're not responding to the needs of the people on some issue, there's an avenue for citizens to band together and take action themselves. And I want to give you one example of how that works, how the system can actually become misrepresentative. Several of us came together in 2017, several of us who grew up in North Idaho came together to start this organization, Reclaim Idaho. And the first big thing that we wanted to address, what motivated us, was this problem that many of you are very familiar with, called the Medicaid gap. This was a problem where anywhere from 60,000 to 100,000 people in Idaho made too much money to qualify for the existing Medicaid healthcare coverage, but they didn't make enough to qualify for any other government program. So they fell in this gap, and they couldn't possibly afford insurance on the private market, so they just went without healthcare. Meanwhile, at that point, by 2017, there were 6 years ever since the passage of the Affordable Care Act back in 2010. There had been over 6 years where every state in the country had the option to use federal money to expand the Medicaid program, using federal money. But Idaho was one of the states that refused to do it. We won't get into detail about that. But one of the consequences of that is that people all across the state were suffering, and a whole lot more people across the state personally knew someone who was suffering. A well-known example was a woman who worked at a U-Haul center in Idaho Falls who died tragically, not because she had some kind of terminal illness, but because she had an asthma attack and she couldn't afford a new inhaler. And she didn't have healthcare coverage. So she died. The news of her death spread all around the state through op-eds and things. And one of your local legislators, Dan Schmidt, tried to put a bill forward in the legislature. It didn't go anywhere, year after year. Yeah, they vote. Pretty much every year it was shot down in committee and barely even got a hearing, or maybe didn't even get a hearing. So when we came along, to make a very long story short, we got the signatures, went all the way to the ballot. Once it was on the ballot in November of 2018, Medicaid expansion passed with 61% of the vote. And the majority of voters in almost every county voted yes. So it wasn't just Boise and a few other places, it was almost every single county of majority voted yes. In this county, it was well over 60% voted yes, might have even been close to 70, can't remember exactly. Think about that, what Teddy Roosevelt said, when the representation becomes misrepresentative. This is an instance where Medicaid expansion was deeply unpopular in the legislature. It could not get anywhere in the legislature. But then the moment it went to the people directly and was on their ballot, the vast majority supported it. That's an essential example of what the initiative process is for. It's an opportunity when the system of representative government is out of touch with ordinary people, people can band together and take action themselves. Okay, now I'm not going to talk for much longer before opening up to general Q&A. And by the way, when I open up to general question and answer, I also want to invite you to just make a comment if you want to, about if you're someone who believes in the citizen initiative process, if you would like to make a comment about why it's important to you, why it's important that it remains in Idaho. I forgot to mention earlier that when the initiative process was referred to the ballot all the way back in 1912, 72% of the people of Idaho voted to establish it. And as I'll mention in just a moment, all of the polling, public opinion polling in the last couple of years indicates that about that same number of people still support the initiative process, over 70%. But here's the last big thing I want to highlight before opening it up. The initiative process is under attack. And it really has been under a pretty fierce attack ever since the Medicaid expansion initiative won in 2018. Just about every year in the legislature since then, there's been some kind of effort to either restrict or weaken or even dismantle the initiative process. And that's part of a national, it was in part a backlash to Medicaid expansion, but it's also part of a major national wave where all across the country, there are forces at work trying to weaken or dismantle the initiative process. The initiative exists in 24 states. Not every state, but 24 states. And in just about every one of those states, there have been efforts to dismantle the initiative process. This last year, this is part of the reason why I'm here and giving talks like this at a bunch of places around the state. This last year was the most aggressive year yet. There were over 150 bills just in 2025 in state legislatures across the country to try to weaken or dismantle the initiative process.
Did they succeed?
Many of them succeeded, and I will tell you, the question is, did any of them succeed? In Florida, they passed a set of new laws to restrict the initiative process. And before those laws went into effect, there was a group in Florida trying to put Medicaid expansion on the ballot. Florida is one of the states that still hasn't expanded Medicaid. Once those new laws went into effect that weakened the initiative process, made it harder to get initiatives on the ballot, that group in Florida, this was about 2 months ago, they broke the news that because it's now so hard to get initiatives on the ballot, they don't think they can do it for 2026. They might try for 2028, but they're not sure. And here in Idaho, as I described, there were 60 to 100,000 people who needed Medicaid. In Florida, it's well over 1 million people. So all those people are just left without health care because it's so hard to get an initiative on the ballot. in Florida. So over 150 bills all across the country. Just in Idaho in this last year, there were 3 major attempts. None of those 3 passed, thankfully. But I'll say a little bit about what they were. One of them was legislators interfering to try to make it harder to get initiatives on the ballot. So the way they tried to do it is by right now in Idaho, here are the basic requirements, and this is important to have in mind. Basic requirements to get initiative on the ballot is you have to get signatures from 6% of all of the state's voters, which translates to roughly about 100,000 signatures total, if you want to make sure you actually have enough valid signatures to get. So you got to get a huge number of total signatures, about 100,000. And then on top of that, you have to get signatures from 6% of the voters in about half of the districts, in 18 districts. In Idaho, there are 35 districts, so you have to get signatures from 6% in each of 18 different districts. So you can't just go to one, you can't just go to Boise or some other part of the state. You kind of got to get out all over the place to get an initiative on the ballot. One of the changes they tried to pass this last year was to make it so you don't just need the 18 districts, you need all 35 districts. That proposal, let me just back up for a minute, and just because people maybe have some of the fragments of the history here, in case you don't know all of it. In 2021, the legislature proposed a new law that would require all 35 of the state's districts. They passed that law. The Governor Little signed that law. And we, Reclaim Idaho, thought that law was unconstitutional. We thought that it basically would dismantle the initiative process and make it impossible to use. So we sued in the Idaho State Supreme Court. The Idaho State Supreme Court ruled in our favor unanimously, all 5 justices, and they overturned that law. So now we're back to the 18 districts instead of 35. And what the court said was that by requiring all 35 districts, that's actually a form of tyranny, they said. Because it goes at the heart of this basic system of democracy that we have, this initiative process, and it allows any one single district. If you need all 35 districts to get on the ballot, that allows just one district to block the will of the other 34. Right? So even if an initiative gets thousands of signatures in each of the 34 other districts, if it falls short in one district, it doesn't make it. So they called that a form of tyranny. They struck down that law. And they actually declared for the first time in Idaho that the initiative process is a fundamental right in Idaho. It's not just in the Constitution, it's actually a fundamental constitutional right. So in legal terms, that means that the citizen initiative process is similar to the Second Amendment, for example. Right to bear arms, or the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. That's the level that the initiative process is on, according to the Idaho State Supreme Court, as of that decision back in 2021. But how did the legislature react to that? They kept trying to pass the 35 districts again. And what they're doing now, and what they did a couple of months ago back in the last legislative session, is they said, look, we know if we pass this, it will be struck down. So instead of just changing the law, we're going to actually change the Constitution and write the 35 district rule into the Constitution so that it can't get struck down. Now, thankfully in Idaho, if the legislature wants to change the Constitution, to even get that process going, they have to get not just a majority of the legislators, but they have to get 2/3 of the legislators in both chambers, in the House and the Senate. they didn't have the votes to pass it. So that failed, even though it made it through one of the committees. It didn't get through the Senate. So for now, that proposal died, but we have no doubt something like it will come back again. I'll just mention two other bills they tried to get through, and I'll do this really quickly. The second one was the legislature interfering directly in the process to try to make it harder for initiatives to pass once they make it on the ballot. So the way they did that was, okay, say an initiative makes it on the ballot. Right now, the rule is if a signature drive succeeds and an initiative makes it on the ballot, it then goes up for a vote. And if a simple majority of voters vote for it, it becomes law. So 50% plus one vote, it becomes law. What they tried to do with this other bill is raise that threshold to 60%. To make it so that even if the people of Idaho, even if a solid majority votes for an initiative, if it still gets only 59%, it doesn't quite clear 60%, then it doesn't become law, it's defeated. That bill died in committee, but it did have some real support, and we have no doubt that something like that will come back again. And that's also true for the third major bill in this last legislative session, which is that they actually tried to raise the threshold all the way to 66%, 2/3, and what they said was, if an initiative gets a majority but still gets under 66%, then the governor has a right to veto it. So that law similarly didn't quite get the support it needed to get through the legislature last session. But we know how this works. Some of the most dangerous bills, first they come up as a kind of trial run, and then they just come, and if they can't get it through the first year, they just come back and maybe have a different strategy, maybe go from all 35 districts to 32 districts, maybe go from 60% to 58% or something like that. But they'll keep trying, and that is why it's so important to learn about this process, and I'll speak more to that in just a moment. Some really good news that I hinted at a moment ago is that when it comes to this issue of ballot initiative rights and the need to protect the initiative process, the vast majority of people in Idaho actually want it to be protected. So we at Reclaim Idaho commissioned a public opinion poll just a few months ago, and you can see a kind of full breakdown of a whole bunch of the numbers from the poll on the back table on your way out. But what we found was that 80% of Idaho voters believe that it's extremely important that the initiative remains intact. Over 70% are opposed to the efforts by legislators to restrict the process or weaken the process. And again, over 70% say that they're more likely to oppose any legislator who votes to restrict the process. So again, I just had this thought on the drive here. Actually, I'd never made that connection before. But maybe it's because we're at the 1912 building. But back in 1912, when the question was on the ballot, should we create the initiative process for the first time? 72%, a large bipartisan majority of voters voted to establish the initiative process. And to this day, over 70% still support the process. So that's really good news for those of us who believe in the initiative process. The majority is on our side on this. But that's my main call to action tonight. My main call to action tonight is to say, It's not enough to have these, to be armed with these statistics. What really matters, the question that really matters is whether there are enough citizens all across the state who are willing to stand up for the initiative process and speak up for it. Testify on behalf of it when it comes under threat. Write letters to the editor, write op-eds, get on social media to talk about it, talk about how important it is. Write emails to your legislators, call your legislators. And you might have seen the clipboard going around where we're calling on people to sign up to do just that. I think probably a lot of people here are already on our email newsletter for Reclaim Idaho. Even if you're already on that newsletter, it would be helpful if you sign that clipboard, because that's an indication that you're someone who's actually thought about this issue specifically and you're interested in speaking up on this issue. It's helpful for us to have a list of exactly who those people are around the state. And if you haven't, if you're not connected with Reclaim Idaho, then definitely, if you believe in the initiative process, sign up with that clipboard. Because what's going to really make a difference is if there are enough citizens all across the state who are willing to speak up when the next round of bills comes around threatening the process. We need people all across the state to stand up in defense of it. Just having, when legislators know there's a public opinion poll that says over 70% don't want them to restrict the process, they might be impressed by that, but they can also ignore that if they don't think that anyone's really paying attention. But if they know that it's not just that in theory the vast majority support the initiative process, but there's actually thousands of people out there who are watching and who are willing to take action to defend it, that's a different story. That's part of the reason why we still have it, even after 7 years of attacks on it. And so I'm here to really call on you to defend the initiative process in this coming 2026 legislative session. But even beyond that, to just, if you don't already consider this to be a part of your obligation as a citizen of Idaho, I want to ask you to think about the initiative process and defending that process is a basic part of what it means to be a citizen of the state. Because it's such a cherished part of our tradition. And it really is a basic pillar of our democracy in this state. Because going back, all the way back to my opening example, all these reforms that I listed didn't happen through the governor or the legislature or the judiciary. They happened through this thing that's almost like a fourth branch of government, which is the citizen initiative process. So we've got to defend that. Okay, thank you all. With that, I'll open up for questions. Yeah.
I think you ought to make a point of.
Oh.
You ought to make a point of what we did with the Luna laws, that how this was something the legislature did, and the popular stood up and said,
So there's a reference to the Luna laws, and let me just take this as a chance to explain this thing that I didn't explain yet, which is that we have a citizen initiative process created in 1912, but right next to that initiative process on the ballot in 1912 was another reform called the referendum, which is like the close sibling of the initiative process, but it's slightly different. So let's just make sure we're on the same page about what an initiative is and what a referendum is. What an initiative is when citizens come together to draft their own proposal for a law. They then go out and get signatures. They get that proposal directly on the ballot if they fulfill all the signature requirements. They get that proposal on the ballot, and if the majority votes for it, it becomes law. So citizens make their own law. The referendum process is when a law passes in the legislature, and then the citizens have a chance to strike down that law. Not initiate their own law, but strike down a law that the legislature passes. So it's like a citizen veto, in a way. And the way that works is really similar. If a law passes that citizens really don't like, they can get, if they get enough signatures in the required time period, they can put that law directly on the ballot. And then if the majority votes no on that law, it gets struck down. And it doesn't remain law. So that's what happened in 2012 with the Luna laws. There were three so-called reforms of the public education system advanced by a statewide superintendent named Tom Luna. And there were a lot of indications that these reforms were really unpopular, but they still ran them through the legislature over all kinds of public outcry. So a whole bunch of citizens and teachers, including the Idaho Education Association, came together and put all three of those laws on the ballot as a referendum campaign. And they branded them as the Luna laws. And all three of those laws were struck down. The no vote was anywhere from, it varied across the three, but it was like anywhere from 65 to 70%. And one of those laws weakened teachers' collective bargaining rights. One of those laws tried to create a merit pay system for teachers. I won't get into detail about that. And then a third one was a really complicated thing where they made a deal with tech corporations to lease a computer, use taxpayer dollars to lease a computer for every Idaho child. And that one got voted down by 70% of the vote. So that's the referendum process. And that's also important. So I've talked about the initiative process because it's more common, but everything I've said about the initiative also applies to the referendum. We have to protect that as well. And if you want one umbrella term, you could just talk about the ballot measure, the citizen ballot measure system. Okay, I know there were some other hands. Yeah, Brian.
Thank you. I was actually pretty surprised to hear that these only exist in 24 states, I think you said. And it sounds like there's a very strong organization against these. Is there any organization pushing to expand initiative rights to other states and to defend them more generally?
So is there any effort to create an initiative process for the first time in states where it doesn't exist? I have heard of those efforts. For example, in Wisconsin. Wisconsin has a much more mixed political system where the two major parties are in closer competition with one another in Wisconsin. But Wisconsin still, even though it's a purple state, they still haven't expanded Medicaid because they don't have an initiative process. And there's probably a whole long list of reforms that would easily pass in Wisconsin if they had an initiative process, but they don't have it. And that's a moment to reflect on, to actually be grateful about something in the Idaho political system. But to your question, say you're in Wisconsin, are there actually organizations or is there a movement to try to create an initiative process? There are, and I've heard about people organizing to do that. It's extremely difficult because you have to get, like what happened in Idaho, you actually had to have, in 1912, you had to have reform-minded legislators coming together, I believe, widely across party lines. I have to go back because I was trying to think of this, remember this earlier, just how bipartisan that vote was back then. But it was a majority coalition of reform-minded legislators who actually, in some ways, voted to give up some of their power, which is one of the rarest things in human history for powerful people to give up some of their own power, right? But it happened in 1912 in that era, because there was such a massive wave of reform across the United States, especially in the West. So the answer is yes, there are efforts. I don't know, I can't tell you that much about them. I have heard isolated stories here and there, but I think it's really difficult to pull off. All the way back. Oh, let me.
Thanks for coming back up here, and hopefully all of us have had a little aha, like you had your 1912 aha. I've had one tonight. The initiative process, I'm kind of a student of it. Joe and I worked nights together, trying to get the last initiative to pass. The last one really brought to mind how bad it can be if it gets politicized. And I know everything's politicized now, but everything doesn't have to be. I guess I'm kind of holding ground. So if we want the initiative process to continue to have tread in Idaho and be all the things that you described it as being over the years, I think we have to be extremely careful to choose things where we minimize the likelihood of polarization and politicization. And that's upon us. I dare say there isn't a Republican in the room here. So like, that's a symptom of the problem. I'm not saying you haven't done anything well, you've really done incredible stuff. I'm just saying from this point on, can this initiative process be an instrument for us to do things like that can minimize the divide and bring people together? It doesn't surprise me if we have to get 72% of the people in the referendum process to vote against the Luna laws. We were all over the state talking to people. That was completely apolitical. That was just like stupid shit. Sorry, pardon me. So anyway, just a thought.
Yep. Thank you for that. Now, I'll give an example that came to mind when it comes to that. So when you talk about the politicization of an initiative or the initiative process, I take it what you mean is partisanship.
The party went against us.
You mean that the parties became polarized over the issue?
Yes, absolutely.
And that's what happened last year with the open primaries, ranked choice voting, electoral reform, is that in people's minds it became divided by party. So you would vote based on your party identity. And if you're one party, you vote no. If you're other party, you vote yes. And that cuts against everything I've been saying tonight about all these initiatives throughout our history that passed. Every single one of those was very cross-partisan in terms of the support for it. I'll give the example that popped into my mind as you were speaking, and was from here in Latah County back in 2018 in the midst of the Medicaid expansion initiative. There were literally candidates. I'm specifically thinking of one Republican candidate, and then there were Democratic candidates, probably all of them, who were advocating for the initiative. But there was actually a Republican candidate who ended up winning, who advocated for Medicaid expansion too. And that caused some consternation and challenges that some of you might remember, some frustration for different reasons. But it pointed to the reality that it was such a cross-partisan issue that that even a Republican candidate saw some incentive to actually go out and advocate for it. And that certainly showed up when it went before the voters. Something I strongly believe in the way I look at the last election cycle with Proposition 1, the big electoral reform initiative, it was a cross-partisan issue. We have a lot of indications that it was pretty much all the way up to the final month or two. But in that final month or two, in September and October up through the November election, all the partisanship came out, a lot of people started thinking about the national election, and people really kind of put on their partisan identity, and there was an aggressive attack from our opponents, basically making the case that this is a left-wing Democratic initiative, and it worked. Now, to your point, a big part of my reflection on that is, a conclusion that when we as Reclaim Idaho have advocated for issues that are somewhat more kind of bread and butter and less abstract, things that directly impact people's lives and their quality of life in a direct way, like, can you see a doctor when you get sick? Can your cousin see a doctor when they get sick? Can you send your kid to a decent school no matter how much money you make? Is your kid's teacher getting paid enough to where they don't feel like they need to leave the state? Just some really simple things like that. I have no doubt that even with those issues, I've seen it, there will still be the partisan attacks in those final months before Election Day. Our opposition, and there will always be opposition, they will attack it and they will say it's democratic and left-wing and it's not nonpartisan and all those things. But those attacks won't work. At least they won't, they're less likely to work if we can answer right back that, no, this isn't partisan, this is about whether you can go see a doctor when you get sick. And we just have a really simple appeal in response to the partisan attack. No, this isn't partisan, this is whether, teachers have decent enough salary to where they don't leave Idaho. That was a lot harder when we were trying to make the case for a change to the election system.
I can't imagine it's too any more difficult.
Most people, and I don't blame them for this because most people aren't thinking about politics all the time. Most people understand very little about the details of elections already. So it's very difficult to pass any type of electoral reform. In a way, and I say this partly because we had the Alaska-style electoral reform with open primaries and ranked choice voting. That's what we were trying to pass. But even that same year, last year in South Dakota, they tried a simpler version of it, and they lost by almost just as much as we did. And that left me coming away thinking, because there was a lot of the exact same patterns, whether it was South Dakota or here, and that left me thinking that it wasn't so much the exact design, it was the fact that we were trying to change the election system, and that's pretty abstract. And that's hard to do in a political environment that's so polarized.
It's abstract, but it also opened us up to the worst possible situation. And that is people who were told by one political party, this is going to make it easier for the other party to win. That's what happened. We heard that so many times, and we couldn't.
Yeah.
So anyway.
And I just want to be clear. I'm not giving up on the cause of electoral reform. We have to think about the way, we have to keep paying attention to the ways that our election system is broken, and we have to look for openings to try to improve our election system. But that said, I do agree with, I think, the spirit of your comment, that when it comes to really picking up this tool of direct democracy, this initiative process, this cherished tradition that we have, and using it to make our state better, we're going to have a lot more success with issues that more easily cut through all the partisanship. And one of the reasons we chose that initiative this last cycle is we did genuinely believe it did cut through the partisanship. And all the way up until, again, I'd say September or so, I think a lot of you would confirm this. If you went out to the county fair, like in say, not in September, But in, June or something, or well, that's not a good example of the county fair. But if you went out to, say, the county fair a year earlier, in which we were already out there, you would get a pretty warm reception for these ideas. But then once the wave of partisan attacks came in those final months, it was a lot harder. Yeah, I'll give you the mic.
Weren't those partisan attacks primarily from out-of-state people? I mean, I have heard that a lot of out-of-state money came in, and people were just pressured. Is that true or not?
There was some, there were some attacks coming from out of state. So for example, I did a big debate hosted by the statesman at Boise State University, and actually flew in someone from out of state to debate me. But I don't want to, I don't want to give the wrong impression here. There was a lot of local opposition, including in the local Republican Party committees all across the state. And there were in local organizations, in state-based organizations, some of which get a lot of money from out of state, but there was a great deal of local opposition as well. One point I want to make about Proposition 1 that's important, and this is a point that you can make if you're in a discussion with someone who's maybe skeptical of the initiative process, maybe someone who opposed Proposition 1, and again, calling back to the last comment, someone who maybe got a little bit of a bad taste of what the initiative process is about because they didn't like Proposition 1, and that was the last initiative they're thinking about. An important point for us to make, those of us who believe in the initiative process, is that the initiative process gives people the power to vote no, right? And that's important, actually. The people get the last word. So if you didn't like Proposition 1, that's not a reason to not like the initiative process, because the initiative process gave you the opportunity to vote no, and you took that opportunity and you defeated it. You defeated an initiative that you didn't like. So that's important too. That's an important part of the tradition, is that not all initiatives that go on the ballot succeed, and the voters have the last word. And I want to emphasize that because I have reason to believe that that argument has actually worked in the legislature. So, and I can't, speak to, I wasn't in the room hearing it, but I kind of heard secondhand that there were discussions going on among legislators. And it was a persuasive argument to say, okay, you opposed Proposition 1. Proposition 1 lost, and that was part of the initiative. That was the initiative process. It didn't have the support at the end to win, and it didn't win. So, isn't the process working for us? Why would we throw out the process?
So I have a question on that Proposition 1. Why did you combine the open primaries and the ranked choice? Because some of the feedback I got was that people were all for the open primaries, but they were confused about the ranked choice, which is what led them to vote against it.
Okay, so why did we combine the open primaries with ranked choice? I'll just point out again, a lot of people have said that if you took the ranked choice voting part off and just had the open primaries part, that it would have done a whole lot better. But meanwhile, again, there's this example from South Dakota where they just had the open primaries part, and it did they got almost the same result. And I believe the reason for that, and this is something I think is important to understand, if you took ranked choice voting off of the initiative that we proposed, and it was just, for example, a top 4 open primary, then you could elect 4 people in the primary, and they could split the vote 4 ways in the general election, and there's no solution to that. So you could elect a governor with 26% of the vote. For example, you could elect Ammon Bundy governor with 26% of the vote, right? So that's what could happen if you didn't have, because ranked choice voting was just a way to make sure that the winner actually has majority support and you don't split the vote 4 ways. Now, the alternative solution would be to do what South Dakota did and just make it a top 2 open primary. So then you wouldn't split the vote 4 ways. So then the question is, okay, why didn't we do that? Well, consider this. As I said, they tried that in South Dakota and they still lost by a lot. And I think a big part of the reason is, if you just do a top 2 open primary, that's literally the same system as California. So I don't think 2 years ago when we were choosing what, reform to put on the ballot, I don't think anyone would have advocated for putting the exact same system as California on the ballot in Idaho. I think it might have done better by a few points than what we did, but it would have been probably similar to South Dakota, where they lost by almost just as much. Now, the final question, the final thing you might be thinking of is, okay, why couldn't you do a different type of open primary? Like, couldn't you just go back to the open primary system that Idaho used to have? And the answer to that is that system was ruled unconstitutional. So you can't do that system. It was ruled unconstitutional over 10 years ago. So that just gives you a little bit of a sense of why we went about. We chose the same system they had in Alaska because it actually had been on the ballot in Alaska and passed. So that just gives you a little bit of the background there. We're running out of time.
Well, I think that's at least just a thing of starting and ending on time.
Okay.
If you want
Okay.
to wrap up and people can stay and
Okay.
questions after.
Can we do one more?
Yes.
There's a big one.
Well, I understand that the reason for tonight is because they're listening to the initiative process, and is the main risk that they're just trying to expand it for the necessity of every county meeting for the 6% openness? That's the main risk.
Would you repeat the question?
So you said risk, I would say threat is even better word. The thing that we're facing probably in the next legislative session, maybe in the next few legislative sessions, is these threats to the initiative process where they would try to pass a law either to require signatures from every district in the state, like they've been trying to do for years, or by creating a system where you have to get 60% of the vote or more to pass an initiative, or something like that, right? So these efforts, and sometimes they'll get probably really creative. You can come up with new ways to try to weaken the initiative. So that's why we've got to be ready. We've got to have thousands of people around the state willing to speak up, write emails, make phone calls, testify, all of these things to defend the initiative process. So if you haven't already done this, make sure, if you believe in the initiative process, make sure that you sign up with us. And then one last call to action I have, I'll hang around. If you're one of the people who had a question still, I'd love to stick around and talk with you, answer any questions. And then that last call to action is, if you're willing to record a short video, and it's just going to be an iPhone video where you just say some version of, I believe in Idaho's ballot initiative because, or I believe Idaho's ballot initiative process should be protected because, and then say why. We're getting videos from people all across the state, and we're going to share those on social media during the ramp up to the legislative session. So if we could get at least 1 or 2 or 3 people here to do that, that'd be awesome. Okay, with that, thank you all.